Hello, everyone, and as always, welcome back to my channel. Or if it's your first time, welcome to my channel. My name is Marlene, and I talk about eating disorder recovery and everything related to healing the relationship with your own body, with food, and with movement. Let's dive right into the topic as we always do. As you can see in the title of this video, I do want to share a little bit more about my personal eating disorder story again, also what helped me, but I do want to go a little bit more into detail about some things that I haven't quite talked about before. And part of the reason is that I was interviewed again this week, and while talking about my personal story, some pieces came together that I realized I've never shared before. So maybe it resonates with somebody. Maybe it gives some of you guys some hope, because I want you to know that full recovery is possible. Whatever full recovery means for you, whatever your definition of it is, but it is possible. So those of you who've been following along for a while probably know parts of the story, but I'm going to tell it anyway because, again, maybe it resonates with some of you, maybe it gives some of you some answers or just a little bit of hope. So until I was 16, I would say that I never really had an issue with my body or with food. I pretty much ate what I wanted to. I would say that I had a really balanced and good relationship with food. It was never like I was cutting out anything, but I also was able to listen to my hunger cues. It was just never really a big topic. However, my whole life, I did not feel enough. I always felt like there was something wrong with me. I had very, very low self-esteem, and I did indeed struggle with the way that I looked. I didn't really struggle with my body as much, or in some parts of my life, I actually found myself too skinny because I was comparing myself to other girls in my age groups, and I was, a little bit of a late bloomer, if you will. I always hated my face, my hair. I would always find things about myself that I didn't quite like. And interestingly enough, until I was 16, that never really projected towards my body. Again, that part never really was an issue. But then at the age 16, 17, when a lot of change in my life happened and a lot of people moved away or, went to another country, a divorce happened in my life. And this is not to blame anyone, because those things sadly happened, but because it all came together, I felt like I was being left. I felt like everyone is leaving me, or at least, even though I was aware that it was not because of me, I still felt very lonely. And so during that time, all of a sudden, I got this idea of going on a diet. And I remember that it still wasn't really to lose weight, ironically enough. It was more like, I'm going to try something new. And I did want to change something about my appearance. I think it was just, the easiest thing to me to focus on, because everything else in my life felt like it was kind of falling apart. And so I tried this. And again, before that, I had a very healthy relationship with food. I would never restrict. I was very hungry. I was always a very hungry kid, but I always made sure to eat enough. And so this was the first time in my life where I actively held myself back from eating certain things and started to learn more about, not learn more about food, but learn more about diets rather. And so the more I Googled and the more I learned, the worse everything sounded. It was like nothing was okay anymore, because this one diet would tell you to not eat carbs, and the other one told you to not eat fat, and the third one told you to not eat something else. And so in the end, it was kind of like, oh my God, no matter what I eat, it's all going to be bad. And so I tried different diets, and I quote unquote failed, is what I told myself, because I was never really able to stick with it. I was trying to follow a diet, and then if I was invited to somebody, they had a certain food, I would just eat a lot of it, because it felt like I couldn't help myself back anymore. So of course, I was convinced that I had developed binge eating, when it was actually just my body's reaction to the restriction. And then occasionally, every few weeks, it felt like I didn't have the discipline anymore. And so that part, telling myself, oh my God, I'm not even good enough for that, played into my low self-esteem again, and led to the fact that my self-esteem was going even lower and lower. At the same time, I started to work out again, because I felt like I want to be good at something. So I started to work out, and I felt like I didn't really have the endurance. I felt like I wasn't really athletic enough. I had, we had in Germany, it's a little bit different than in the US, but we still had certain sports team in my school, and I wasn't really on any sports team. I was never with the cool kids. So I wanted to get better at sports on my own. But it was not because I really had a passion for it, because again, before I had my eating disorder, before I developed all these behaviors, I actually did like to move my body. I actually did like it, but not in that obsessive way that I started to do then. And so again, every time when I felt I failed or I was not good enough, which was pretty much all the time, because I started to set like higher and higher and higher goals for myself, which was kind of like self-sabotaging because I could never reach them. So every time I could not reach a goal, or I told myself that I am not good enough for those super high standards that I would set for myself, of course, it had a negative impact on my self-esteem again. At the same time, I also started to compare myself even more. Now that I mentioned earlier, I was always somebody who would compare herself to other people, or also who was compared to other people by certain family members, and also in schools, like, kids can be very cruel and can be very rude. So I was compared to like other people, or I was compared to, like movie characters that I didn't want to be compared to, because there was a phase in my life where I was also bullied. So, all this comparison, whether it was like to be compared with somebody and it was clearly within like a bullying situation, or I would compare myself to somebody else, of course, also took a hit on my self-esteem again. So I went online a lot, and back then Instagram, for instance, was way less regulated than it is today. And I would just see those glorified images of like the fit, skinny girls with a lot of filters. And, there was just like a certain aesthetic in 2012, 2013. And when I say aesthetic, I just mean the kind of pictures that they used back then. I'm not saying that it was actually aesthetic or something that I should have ever tried to reach, but I was also a teenager, and so I kind of, wanted to be that girl. And this is actually a term that came up in the last few years, that girl. I'm going to touch on that a little bit later in this video. But this also led to the fact that I felt like, oh, those girls in those pictures, they look so cool and so pretty and so fit and so, fashionable, and they're probably having the perfect life, even though, of course, it was just a picture, but that was the story that my brain told myself around it. And the same thing on Tumblr, which, was way worse for me, because on Tumblr, I actually really got into those niches of like, eating disorders and glorifying eating disorders and glorifying everything that has to do with it. So in my brain, it was kind of like, oh, that sounds great. Maybe that can be a community that I was part of. Now, mind you, it was not like I didn't have friends. I had great friends, and many of them are still my friends to this day. And yet it felt like I need to be very good at something, and I need to be part of a certain community. Fast forward a little bit later, I met my first boyfriend at the time, and while he always gave me a lot of encouragement, a lot of compliments, he would always compliment the way I looked, and of course that felt very good, and I think that's what everyone wants from a spouse, more or less. But at the same time, it felt like it was very much connected to certain conditions, even though that's never what he said, but I heard that. So for instance, he would always tell me, oh, I like that you're so fit. I like to have such an athletic girlfriend. So of course, in my brain, I was like, oh, if I ever stop being athletic, he's going to leave me, or I'm not going to be good enough anymore. And when his parents put him on a diet, which I till this day don't understand, that was when things got really, really worse for the first time. Because being with a partner that focuses so much on his body and losing weight and counting calories, even though it wasn't even his idea or his intention, and also from the outside, I never felt the need for him to do that. So it was even more confusing. I told myself, like, why would somebody else, why would his own parents tell him that when I didn't even understand it and I didn't even see the need for it? But at the same time, of course, if you're already vulnerable, you're already in this space and your self-esteem is already very low, and then you're with a partner that is doing those exact things, focusing on these exact things, it's most probably going to have an impact on you. And I see that in my clients all the time. And this is part of recovery, is to learn to not let your actions be influenced by it anymore, but it's a very, very, very tough thing to learn. And so when you're not even aware yet what's going on and that you're developing an eating disorder, you're probably not even going to be aware of that. And so I kind of learned things from him, and my eating disorder got worse and worse, and eventually the relationship ended due to that. which of course felt like, oh, somebody else was leaving me, which was the case. But it was yet another person that was leaving me. And so all those emotions from 2 years before came up again. And for a short amount of time, I actually started or tried recovery because I told myself, if I'm just showing him that I'm getting better, he's going to get back together with me, which of course wasn't the case. And so that attempt was not really sustainable because I didn't do it for myself. I just did it so that somebody else would come back to me, which didn't end up being the case. And so shortly afterwards, I checked myself in a clinic and I stayed 3.5 months there, but the issue was still the same. I didn't really want to recover. I wanted them to give me the magic word. I wanted them to make me healthy, but there was no intention from my side to actually change something. And my biggest thing was I didn't want to gain weight. At that point in my life, I was so convinced that I could never accept myself when gaining weight, because if I already was in a sick body and I felt like every gram that's more on the scale is already the end of the world for me, how would I ever be able to accept a healthy body? That was my mindset. And so even though the clinic was not helpful for me, I definitely learned some skills. I had some therapy. I met some really great people. It definitely did not help me to recover. And afterwards, I started going to college, and during my whole time in college, my whole bachelor's and my whole master's, I still had a full-blown eating disorder that several times nearly costed me my life. And while I was in college, I was doing my college classes. I was working full-time. I had my own businesses. I was working freelance. I was doing a lot. And so I always convinced myself nothing can be that bad. It can't really be that bad if I'm still able to do all those things. Of course, I always prioritized my eating disorder. If I had an exam, I would just walk around outside all the time and listen to notes on my phone and convince myself, I'm just going for a walk and this is great because it helps me to learn, when of course this was a really bad eating disorder behavior. Everything, my whole life still revolved around my eating disorder, and it always had the biggest priority, which led to situations where I neglected people that are very close to me, where I didn't attempt birthdays or certain celebrations, where I would always choose my eating disorder. And this is one of the very hard truths that I had to admit to myself in my eating disorder, and then also later in recovery, because there comes a point where you just realize what you've done for so long and for so many years. And this does not mean that it makes you a bad person, not at all. It just shows you how much power the eating disorder really has, because it will take control over parts of your life that you really don't want it to take control over. Fast forward again, by the end of college, I actually received my green card. And so I decided to move to the States, to New York first, and then eventually to California. So when I moved to New York, I told myself that I really have to give recovery another try. I was very aware that this was a very lifelong dream that I had. And now I finally was able to move here. So I told myself, you cannot move there and don't recover, because you will never be able to fully live that dream that you've dreamt up for so long. And that was when I gave recovery a real shot, and I gave myself a promise to not go back and to do whatever it takes. And this attempt was my last and only successful recovery attempt. And this does not mean that I didn't struggle. Oh my God, I struggled badly. I actually had to go back to Germany for a year to seek some more professional help. I wanted to go back so many times. This was hands down, those were 2.5, 3 of the hardest years of my life, for sure. It actually felt harder and way worse than my eating disorder, because while in my eating disorder, I also had definitely depressive episodes, which, a lot of people with eating disorders know, but it was nothing compared to what I felt in my recovery. And that was so devastating, because I thought, once I start recovery, I will eat more and I will have more energy and I will feel better, when of course, or not of course, but in my case, the opposite was the case. And I always tell that so openly, not to make you feel afraid. I've worked with a lot of people that didn't go through such a hard time. Of course, for the majority of people, recovery will be challenging. But there's also people that don't go through that kind of depression. But in my case, it was something that I was going to, and it still didn't mean that I couldn't recover. So if you're watching this right now and you are aware you either have those feelings right now or you've had those feelings in a past recovery attempt, and so now you're hesitating to give it another try, please know that I know that it feels like the end of the world, but it will get better again. My recovery, by the way, took quite some time. As I said before, like at least 2.5 to 3 years for my mind and my body to recover, because gaining weight does not mean that you're fully recovered. In my case, it actually meant that I had to start the whole process at a certain point because my body gained way more weight than I thought I would. It was definitely way more than I was weighing before my eating disorder. And of course, that whole progress in itself was so hard because I was surrounded by certain people that wouldn't understand it. People would make comments. And it was just a really, really tough time. And at the same time, I continued to tell myself, going back is not an option. It also felt impossible for me to go back at that point. But I also knew that I don't know how much I'm going to make it if I go back to my eating disorder now. So I actually just have the option to continue. I personally experienced extreme hunger and I fully listened to it. I also took a very long break from working out. So of course, these parts can also be very hard to justify, for instance, in the medical system or even for family members. And I am so aware how challenging it can be to go through the time and to having to explain yourself or noticing that people around you don't really understand what's going on. But for me personally, it was so important to tell myself, you have to push through. Let's just see what happens. Let's just continue to move on and to go on. And that doesn't mean, again, that I didn't struggle or that I didn't have all the fears that, so many of my clients have, so many people have in the comments here, like people with eating disorders overall, from being afraid that it's not extreme hunger, but it's binge eating. What if I will never stop gaining weight? What if I'm losing control completely? What if I'm just lazy? What if I'm just greedy? What if this is not working for me? And so many other what ifs. So I really, really, really know all those fears. And I still want you to know that those are some of the most common fears in recovery. You're not alone with it. And it's most probably the eating disorder speaking. I also had to really, really, really work on my self-worth, my self-esteem. And it's something that I'm working on till this day. Because just because you're recovered and you don't have the behaviors anymore, and you were able to rewire your brain, doesn't mean that all the problems resolve themselves. And that was another hard truth to swallow. Because other problems came up, all the things that I had suppressed for so long, certain emotions, other things came up for me that I had to start working on. So while in the beginning I thought, I'm just going to do this recovery thing and then it's going to be over with, it brought up more things, which is not a bad thing because sooner or later those things would have come up anyway. But again, it was just something else that was kind of disappointing, to be completely honest. This was my story wrapped up and focused on some other things than I talked about before. I really hope this video helped you guys. I really, really hope that it can give somebody some motivation or it resonated with somebody. As always, please let me know in the comments. Please also let me know where you are at in your recovery journey. And as always, what other topics you would like me to cover. And I will see you in the next one.